Copper Creek, summer of 1873. Her knees hit the dirt, her land deed torn to pieces at her feet. Jubal Vance looked down at her. A widow's place is submissive. That's civilization. She pressed her bleeding palms into the earth and stared straight back at him. Then the ground shook, iron wheels on dry road, and a giant stepped out of an armored wagon and changed everything. Stay with us. You'll want to see where this goes. The sun over Copper Creek didn't just shine. It pressed down, like a flat iron on wet cloth, relentless and without mercy, baking the cracked earth until every living thing either bent or broke. Evelyn Vance had been bending for years. She knelt by the wash tub behind her cabin, arms plunged elbow-deep in water, gone gray with lye. Her hands had stopped hurting around the second hour. Now, they just bled quietly, thin, red threads swirling into the suds before disappearing. She didn't look at them. Looking made it worse. Better to focus on the sheet, on the scrubbing, on the next task after this one, and the one after that. That was how you survived out here. You kept moving. You didn't think too hard about the life you were living. The sound of horses reached her before the dust cloud did. 3 riders. She knew without turning around. She knew the rhythm of those hooves the way a person knows a bad dream coming back in the middle of the night. Slow, deliberate, meant to make you wait and dread. She dried her hands on her apron anyway, stood up straight, turned around. Jubal Vance sat astride a pale horse at the edge of her yard, his 2 men flanking him like parentheses, around a threat. He was a broad man gone soft with age, his belly straining against a wool vest that probably cost more than everything Evelyn owned combined. Silver watch chain, clean boots, the kind of clean that only comes when other people do your dirty work for you. Evelyn, he said her name. The way men like him said everything like he was doing her a favor just by acknowledging she existed. Mr. Vance? She kept her voice flat. He swung down from the saddle without hurry, slapping dust from his sleeve as he crossed the yard toward her. His men stayed on their horses. They didn't need to move. His presence was already filling up the space, crowding her back toward the washtub. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. Her papers, her deed, her water claim, the filings she'd spent 3 months and nearly every dollar she had scraping together at the territorial office. She felt her stomach drop. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at her. Then he tore them in half. The sound was small, just a soft ripping noise, barely louder than the wind. But it hit her somewhere behind the ribs. He tore the halves again and again. Let the pieces drift out of his fingers like he was scattering feed for chickens. "This is foolishness," he said almost gently. "You know that, don't you? Running around filing claims, playing at being a landowner." He stepped closer. "You're a widow girl. My nephew's widow at that. You have a place in this world, and it is not behind a deed. That land belonged to my husband." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which means it passes to me. It passes to the family. He said it like it was scripture. Final, already decided by God and geography alike. You have no children, no male kin, no standing. What you have is the charity of people who could just as easily leave you with nothing. She'd looked him square in the eye. That was the only fight she had left to give him right now. Just that not looking away. He shoved her, one hard push with the flat of his palm against her shoulder. She went down fast, her knees hitting the dirt and her palms scraping gravel. The breath left her body all at once. She heard his voice above her, unhurried and cold. "A widow's place is submissive. That's not cruelty. That's civilization. You do well to remember it before you make another foolish decision." She pressed her bleeding palms into the earth and breathed. She didn't cry. She thought about crying the way you think about falling asleep during a hard task, something that would feel good and was absolutely not an option right now. She was still on her knees in the dirt when the sound came. It was low at first, a deep, rolling vibration she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. Then the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on hard ground, the heavy percussion of a draft horse team moving at a working pace, and the long, dark shadow of something very large pulling into the far end of the road. The wagon was enormous, armored along its sides with iron plating, piled high with raw timber and supply crates. It moved through Copper Creek like a slow ship coming into harbor. People on the boardwalk stopped and stared. Conversations died, even the horses tied to the rail. Out front of the saloon, shifted and tossed their heads. Then the driver pulled the team to a halt, and people stared harder. The man who climbed down from that wagon seat was built the way certain things in nature are built: mountains, old-growth timber, storm fronts moving in from the north. He stood somewhere around 6.5 feet and wore a coat stitched together from bear hide, dark with age and weather. His face was weathered and angular beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, and his hands, gripping the wagon rail as he dropped to the ground, were the size of dinner plates. Gideon Stone didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Evelyn. More specifically, he looked at Jubal Vance standing over Evelyn, and at Evelyn on her knees in the dirt, and something shifted in his expression. Not rage. Exactly. Something quieter and considerably more dangerous than rage. He crossed the yard in long, unhurried strides. Jubal turned at the sound of the footsteps. To his credit, he didn't flinch immediately. He had 2 men on horses and a reputation in this town, and probably assumed those things would matter to whoever was walking toward him. His hand moved toward the revolver at his hip. Gideon's hand moved faster. Nobody in the crowd quite saw how it happened. One moment, Jubal had his fingers on the grip, and the next moment the gun was in Gideon's hand, and Jubal was standing there empty-handed, blinking. Gideon turned the revolver over, checked it once with the practiced ease of a man who'd been handling firearms since before Jubal started wearing a watch chain, then simply held it at his side. He looked down at Jubal. The height difference was almost absurd. Jubal had to tilt his chin up to meet his eyes, and clearly didn't appreciate the experience. Gideon's voice, when it came, was low and gravelly and completely, utterly calm. Out here, a man's strength isn't measured by how hard he can push a woman down. Silence. A real silence, the kind that makes you aware of wind and breathing, and the blood moving through your own veins. Jubal's men on their horses exchanged a glance. Neither one moved. Jubal's jaw worked. His face had gone a dark mottled red. "You have no idea what you're stepping into, stranger." Gideon didn't answer that. He reached down without taking his eyes off Jubal and offered his free hand to Evelyn. She hesitated only a second before taking it. His grip was warm and steadying, and he pulled her upright with no effort at all, like she weighed nothing. She got her feet under her and let go of his hand, and immediately busied herself, brushing the dirt from her dress, because she didn't know what else to do with herself. Gideon set Jubal's revolver down on the top rail of the fence, barrel pointing away from everyone, a deliberate choice. He wasn't keeping it. He was just making clear he could. Jubal straightened his vest with sharp, angry tugs. He looked at Evelyn, then back at Gideon, calculating something. Whatever he calculated, he didn't like his odds today. "This isn't finished," he said. "I expect not," Gideon replied. Jubal turned, mounted his horse, and rode out with his men behind him. The crowd on the boardwalk parted to let them through, then slowly, reluctantly, went back to their business. Evelyn looked down at her hands. She'd torn them up fresh when she fell, and blood was beading along her knuckles again, bright against the pale skin. She wiped them on her apron, the same automatic gesture she'd used all morning. She heard Gideon shift beside her. When she looked up, he was watching her hands, his brow drawn into something that wasn't quite a frown, more like recognition. Like he'd seen that exact gesture before, that specific wiping away of something that deserved tending. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't make a fuss or demand she accept his concern. He just looked at her the way you look at someone and actually see them: the endurance in her posture, the iron in the set of her jaw, the fact that she'd stayed on her feet through everything this morning, except the moment a man's hand forced her off them. Evelyn squared her shoulders and met his gaze. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am?" She gave a short nod. Around them, Copper Creek went on humming with its ordinary afternoon sounds, boots on boardwalk, a dog barking somewhere, the distant ring of a hammer at the blacksmith's. But something had shifted. A before and after, quiet as a page turning. Evelyn looked out at the road where Jubal's dust cloud was still settling. She knew this wasn't over. Jubal Vance had never in his life walked away from something he wanted, and simply stopped wanting it. She looked back at the giant cowboy standing in her yard, one hand resting easy on the fence rail, apparently in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. Her hands still bled, the sun still pressed down like a flat iron on wet cloth. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn Vance didn't feel entirely alone in the middle of it. The fire started after dark. Evelyn smelled it before she saw it, that sharp, resinous bite of pine catching fast. The kind of smell that jolts you out of sleep like a hand grabbing your collar. She was already at the window when the first orange tongue of flame licked up the side of the cabin wall, and she was already pulling on her boots when she understood that this fire had not started by accident. Nobody's fire starts at 3 different corners of the building at the same time by accident. She grabbed her coat, her mother's small Bible from the shelf beside the door, and nothing else. There was nothing else to grab. Everything she owned fit in those 2 items and the clothes on her back, and even as she shoved out through the door into the freezing night, she understood that this was exactly what Jubal Vance had intended. Not just to burn the cabin, to burn the idea that she had anything worth fighting for. The cold hit her like a wall. It wasn't just cold, it was that early season mountain cold that has ice in its teeth, the kind that finds every gap in your clothing and goes straight to the bone. The wind had picked up hard while she slept and was driving horizontal snow across the open ground, turning the yard into a howling white blindness. The fire behind her roared and popped as the walls gave way, throwing wild orange light across the snow. And for a moment she stood in that strange no-man's land between burning and freezing and couldn't make herself move in either direction. Then she moved, because standing still was death, and she'd made her peace with a lot of things, but not with that. She walked, head down, one arm up against the wind, the Bible pressed to her chest under her coat. She didn't have a destination. The town was 3 miles east, and she'd freeze solid long before she reached it in this storm. The nearest neighbor she trusted was further than that. She just walked, because walking was the only option left to her. She'd gone maybe a quarter mile when she heard the wagon. She almost didn't look up. The wind was making all kinds of sounds in the pines, and she'd learned not to trust her ears in a storm. But the sound persisted, that heavy, rolling, iron-rimmed rumble she'd heard that afternoon, distinct as a church bell, and she lifted her face into the wind just as a dark shape materialized out of the snow ahead. The team of draft horses emerged first, pale gray ghosts in the lantern light, their breath billowing in great white clouds. Then the wagon itself, iron-sided and massive, its running lamps throwing twin gold circles against the storm. It pulled to a stop directly in front of her. She stood there in the middle of the road, half frozen and holding a Bible, and for a long, stupid moment, she couldn't think of a single sensible thing to do. The wagon seat creaked. Heavy boots hit the ground. Gideon Stone came around the front of the team and stopped when he saw her. He took in the smoke smell clinging to her hair, the empty road behind her, the fact that she was carrying nothing but a coat and a book. His jaw tightened. That was all just that one small movement, but it said everything he wasn't putting into words. He didn't ask what happened. He could see what happened. He crossed to her in 2 long strides, and she had exactly half a second to register that he was reaching for her, before one massive arm came under her knees, and the other went around her back, and he lifted her clean off the ground as easily as a man lifting a sack of flour. Her first instinct was to protest some old reflex firing about propriety and what was proper and what people would say. But the cold had eaten through her coat entirely, and his chest was warm and solid, and the protest died somewhere between her brain and her mouth. He carried her around to the wagon's side door, pulled it open, and ducked inside with her still in his arms, the wind screaming outside and the snow driving hard against the iron walls. Inside was another world entirely. The wagon was fitted out for long hauls, a narrow cot along one wall, supply crates stacked and roped along the other. A small copper stove bolted to the floor in the far corner with a pipe running up through the roof. The stove was lit and throwing real heat, filling the space with the smell of pine smoke and cured leather and something faintly like coffee from a tin pot sitting on the iron top. A single lantern hung from a hook overhead, and it swayed gently with the wagon's settling weight, making the shadows move like slow water across the walls. Gideon set her down on the cot with the same care you'd use setting down something that could break. Though something in his expression said, he suspected she was less breakable than she looked. He straightened up, pulled a heavy woolen blanket from the shelf above the cot, and draped it around her shoulders. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet enough to fit the small space. Respecting a person starts with making sure they have a safe place to breathe, he said, tucking the blanket edge around her, no matter who they are or what title they carry. Evelyn looked up at him. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He wasn't waiting for her to tell him what a good man he was. He said it because he meant it. The same way a person states a fact they've simply always known to be true, and then he moved to the copper stove to check the fire and add a split of wood like the matter was settled. She pulled the blanket tighter and let the warmth start working through her layers. Her hands had gone numb and were now beginning the painful process of coming back, the blood returning in hot stabs to each finger. She pressed them between her knees and watched him move around the small space, efficient and unhurried, a big man who'd learned to move carefully through tight quarters. They burned it down, she said. I know. He didn't look up from the stove. I saw the smoke from the pass road. That's why I turned back. She absorbed that. He'd turned back, changed his direction, in a blizzard, in the middle of the night, because he'd seen smoke coming from the direction he'd last seen her. She didn't say anything about it. She just noted it. The same way you note where the solid ground is when everything else is uncertain. Outside, the storm built itself into something enormous, the wind hitting the iron walls in long, shuddering waves, the pine branches thrashing against the roof. Inside, the copper stove ticked and glowed. The lantern swayed. The coffee smell deepened into something real and warm. Gideon poured 2 cups without asking, set one beside her on the cot, and lowered himself onto a supply crate with the other. His knees were nearly at the level of the cot. He was almost comically large in the small space, but he managed it without crowding her, keeping a distance that was deliberate and respectful. He didn't pepper her with questions. He didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances about how everything would be fine, which she appreciated because she had no patience for lies right now, however kindly meant. They sat in the warmth and listened to the storm try its best against the iron walls. Evelyn held her coffee cup in both hands and felt for the second time that day the strange, unfamiliar sensation of not being completely alone in something. She wasn't sure what to do with that feeling. She'd had so little practice with it. The snow kept driving. The stove kept burning. And the wagon held. The storm didn't let up until nearly morning. Evelyn drifted in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep, more like the exhausted half-consciousness that follows sustained fear, where your body finally stops running, even though your mind hasn't gotten the message yet. Each time she surfaced, the stove was still lit, and the lantern was still swaying, and Gideon was still there, sometimes adding wood, sometimes just sitting with his coffee and watching the flame through the stove's iron grate. At some point, deep in the night, the wind dropped enough that the silence felt sudden and strange. Gideon was sitting beside the cot by then, on an upturned crate, and he had her hands in his, and he was applying something from a small tin of salve that smelled like beeswax. and something herbal. Calendula, maybe, to the cuts on her knuckles, with the careful attention of a man who understood that small wounds left untended have a way of becoming serious ones. His thumbs moved slowly across her palms, working the salve into the cracked skin with steady, gentle pressure. Evelyn watched his face while he worked. He wasn't watching her back. He was watching her hands, frowning slightly, with the focused concentration of someone doing a task they care about doing properly. Nobody had tended to her hands in longer than she could remember. Thaddeus certainly never had. Thaddeus had other uses for his hands. She felt something shift in her chest, not grief, not quite. Something older and more complicated than grief. Something that lived in the space between who you used to be and who you'd had to become just to keep breathing. Gideon looked up then. He looked up and she was already looking at him, and for a moment neither of them did anything sensible at all. He moved slowly. She had time to see it coming and time to decide, and she decided. His mouth found hers, and the kiss began with a patience she hadn't known to expect from a man built on that scale. No urgency, no demand, just warmth and steadiness, and the faint taste of coffee, giving her every opportunity to set the terms. She kissed him back. She put her free hand against his jaw and felt the rough texture of several days' worth of beard and the solid warmth beneath it. And something in her chest cracked open just slightly, like a window in a stuffy room. His hand slid to her knee, moved slow up her thigh, and her whole body locked. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't thought at all, just the sudden, cold clench of old conditioning firing through her. Thaddeus's voice, and Thaddeus's hands, and all the years of learning that her body was a territory she had no sovereignty over. Her breath caught. Her eyes stung. She pulled back just enough, and the words came out small and raw, barely above a whisper. "I can't. I'm a widow," the Virgin whispered. The words were only half the truth. The other half was harder to say that the marriage had been a prison with a locked door, that Thaddeus had been cruel in ways that stopped well short of the marital act, because his cruelties had other shapes, that she had never once in her married life been touched with anything resembling tenderness. That she was still, in the most literal sense, untouched. Gideon stopped. No hesitation, no negotiation, no attempt to talk her back to where they'd just been. He stopped, and he pulled back, and he waited with his hands still, and his eyes steady on her face. He looked at her for a long moment. Not with frustration, not with the particular wounded pride men so often wore when they didn't get what they decided they were entitled to. He looked at her with clear eyes, and he said, quietly and without any drama whatsoever, "You tell me to stop, and I stop. You don't belong to a dead man." He held her gaze. "This body belongs to you." The simplicity of it undid her. Not the words alone. She'd heard pretty words before. They were cheap and easy to manufacture. It was the way he'd stopped before he said them. It was the stopping first, and the speaking second, the action preceding the declaration, his body honoring what his mouth then named. She breathed. The tears didn't fall. She held them back through sheer stubbornness, which was maybe the most Evelyn Vance thing she'd ever done in her life. She looked at him, at this giant, quiet man sitting back from her, on an upturned crate in a mountain pass, in the middle of a dying blizzard, who had disarmed Jubal Vance in the town square without throwing a single punch, who had lifted her out of a frozen road and carried her somewhere warm, and then made coffee, who had sat up, tending her hands all night, and then stopped the moment she needed him to stop. She reached out and took his face in both hands. He went very still. She kissed him this time. Her choice, her pace, her direction. The fear didn't disappear all at once. It retreated slowly, like ice giving way to spring, edge by edge and inch by inch, making room for something it had been crowding out for years. His hands moved only where she allowed them, and stopped when she tensed and returned when she softened, patient and unhurrying, as if they had the rest of the blizzard and the rest of the night, and the rest of whatever came after to figure this out together. The stove threw its copper light across the wagon walls. The snow settled quiet on the roof. The lantern swayed on its hook in the fading wind, and Evelyn Vance, who had learned to survive by making herself small and still and undemanding, let herself take up space. She was slow at first, careful, waiting for the trap in it, the catch, the moment when tenderness would show its teeth. It didn't come. Every time she hesitated, he waited. Every time she moved forward, he followed her lead. There was no performance in it. No conquest, just two people in a warm space in the middle of a storm, figuring out how to be present with each other. At some point, the careful part fell away, and what replaced it was real. His strength, which she'd expected to feel like a cage, felt like being held by something that had no intention of dropping her. His patience, which she'd expected to run dry the moment he got what he wanted, turned out to be genuinely structural. Not a strategy, but a character, built into him somewhere deep. She understood, somewhere in the middle of it, that this was what the absence of cruelty actually felt like. And the realization hit her somewhere private and fundamental, and rearranged things that had been in the wrong position for years. She was loud once. She pressed her face against his shoulder immediately after, embarrassed. His chest rumbled with something low and warm that wasn't quite a laugh. He tucked her hair back from her face with one finger. She stopped being embarrassed. The blizzard finished dying sometime before dawn. The silence that replaced it was the deep, snow-muffled quiet of a mountain pass after a storm, absolute and clean. Evelyn lay with her back against his chest and his arm around her, and listened to him breathe. Outside, everything was buried and still, and new-looking. She didn't think about Jubal. She didn't think about the deed, or the cabin, or the pile ash, and scorched timber it had become overnight. Those things were real, and she'd have to face them. And she would, because she was still Evelyn Vance, and Evelyn Vance had never yet found a problem she could solve by falling apart. But not yet. Not right this second. Right now she breathed. She let the stove warm her back, and she listened to the mountain quiet, and she stayed exactly where she was. It was, she thought, a place worth staying. The ranch sat 3 miles north of Copper Creek, in a wide, sheltered valley where two ridgelines met and cut the wind down to something manageable. Ponderosa pines stood thick on the slopes above it, and a frozen creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, promising water come spring. The main house was built from squared timber, solid and low-slung against the landscape, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that faced south toward the morning sun. Evelyn saw it for the first time through the wagon's small front window, gray dawn light, just beginning to pick the details out of the dark. And her first thought was that it looked like a place someone had actually meant to stay in. Not just to survive, but to live. Gideon pulled the team around to the barn and got them settled before anything else. She watched him work, unhitching, watering, forking hay into the stall with the same unhurried efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. He was a man who did necessary things first and didn't make a performance of it. By the time they reached the porch, the front door had already opened. Jesse stood in the doorway, with a blanket around his shoulders, and sleep still creasing one side of his face, somewhere between 10 and 12 years old, lean and watchful, with large dark eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Gideon first, then at Evelyn, then back at Gideon, with an expression that asked several questions simultaneously without putting any of them into words. "Got caught in the pass," Gideon said, stomping snow off his boots. Storm came on fast. Jesse's gaze moved to Evelyn again, measured. Not unfriendly, just careful, the careful of a child who'd learned early that new people in your life weren't automatically safe ones. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "Jesse." He stepped back to let them in. The inside of the house smelled like wood smoke and cornbread, and a faint trace of kerosene from the lamps. A fire was burning low in the main room hearth, Jesse having clearly stoked it sometime in the night. Books were stacked on a table near the window, not just stacked but open, marked used. A McGuffey reader, a worn copy of Frederick Douglass's autobiography, a geography primer with a cracked spine. Evelyn looked at the books longer than she meant to. She slept most of the morning. When she woke, the sun had moved past noon, and the smell of something cooking had replaced the cornbread. She found Gideon and Jesse at the main table. Jesse bent over a copybook with a pencil, while Gideon sat across from him, a primer open between them. She stopped in the doorway and stayed quiet. Jesse was reading aloud, slow and deliberate, working through a passage with his finger, moving under the words. When he stumbled on something, Gideon pointed to the word and waited while the boy sounded it out, not supplying the answer himself, letting Jesse get there. Jesse got there. Gideon nodded once, the way a person nods when something was expected, and came through as expected. Then he said, without looking up from the book, again from the top of that paragraph. Jesse groaned with the theatrical suffering of a child who had very strong opinions about repetition. Again, Gideon said mildly. Jesse read it again. Better this time. Gideon looked up then and noticed Evelyn in the doorway. He didn't make a thing of it, just gestured toward the pot on the stove, and went back to the lesson. She served herself and sat near the fire and listened to them work through the paragraph twice more before Gideon called it done for the morning. Jesse immediately dropped his pencil with the relief of a man set free from prison. Gideon looked at him. You know why we do this every day? Jesse made a sound that was technically not an argument. Say it, Jesse recited it with the resigned fluency of a phrase said so many times it had become automatic. Because reading is the one thing nobody can take back once you have it. And a pause, then quieter and more genuine, and because you can't be free in your mind if someone else controls what you know. Gideon nodded. He reached over and closed the copybook. Go check the south fence line. Take the gray. Jesse was up and pulling on his coat before the sentence finished. Evelyn ate her soup and said nothing for a moment. Then, how long has he been with you? 3 years. Gideon poured himself coffee, found him in Fort Ellis. His family had been sharecropping for a man who decided he didn't need to pay them anymore. He said it flatly without dramatizing it. Mother didn't make it through the winter. No other kin, and you just took him. Somebody had to. He sat down across from her. He's sharp, reads better than most men in this territory already. Another few years, he'll be sharper still. Evelyn looked toward the window, where Jesse had just ridden past on the gray, upright in the saddle with easy confidence. You're raising him to be free. He already is free. I'm raising him to know it. Gideon turned his cup in his hands. Skin color or a man's name don't mark his worth. Honest labor and a decent heart are the only things that count. He said it the same way. He said most things without flourish, without waiting to see if it landed. It was simply true, and he simply believed it. And that was the end of the discussion as far as he was concerned. Evelyn thought about the men she'd known in her life. Her father, who was weak but not unkind. Thaddeus, who was neither. The parade of territorial men, who measured a person's value by their landholding and their bloodline and the color of their skin. Then this man, sitting across from her with his coffee and his matter-of-fact decency, raising an orphan black boy to read Douglas and ride straight in the saddle and know his own worth down to the bone. She helped with the afternoon work without being asked. Gideon didn't make a comment about it. He just handed her a task when she appeared at his elbow and accepted the help as straightforwardly as she offered it. She was going through supply crates in the storage room, off the main hall, taking inventory, the practical work of figuring out what needed replacing after the long run, when her fingers hit something solid and flat near the bottom of a crate marked Vance Freight. She pulled it out, a silver pocket lighter, octagonal, heavy, the case worn smooth with years of handling. She turned it over. On the back, engraved in the kind of careful script that cost real money, T.V. Thaddeus Vance. She stood there, holding it, and felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. The crate was marked with Jubal's freight stamp, which meant this lighter had come through Jubal's possession, which meant Jubal had something of Thaddeus's, not a keepsake, not an inheritance, but a personal carry item. The kind of thing a man had in his pocket every day of his life. The kind of thing found on a dead man, or kept by a living one. She turned the lighter over again. The silver caught the afternoon light coming through the small storage room window and threw a bright star across the ceiling. She thought about the grave she'd stood over 8 months ago, a wooden cross in the Copper Creek Cemetery, with Thaddeus's name carved rough into the crossbar. She thought about how she'd stood there and felt mostly relief, and then hated herself for feeling relief, and then felt it anyway. She thought about how Jubal had shown up within 2 weeks of that funeral to start pressing his claim to her land. She put the lighter in her dress pocket, said nothing about it yet, but the doubt had taken root, and doubt, once planted, has a way of growing whether you want it to or not. That evening she sat with Gideon on the porch after Jessie had gone in, the temperature dropping fast and clean under a sky going purple and then black. She told him about the lighter, showed it to him, watched his face while he turned it over in those large, careful hands. He was quiet for a long time. "It might be nothing," he said finally. "It might not be." He handed it back to her. "What do you want to do?" Nobody had asked her that in so long. Not what should be done, not what was going to happen, not what the law required, what she wanted. She closed her fingers around the lighter. "I want to file the land claim," she said, "and I want to find out the truth." Gideon nodded, like he'd already known that was coming, and had no objection to either part of it. They sat for a while longer in the cold, and the dark shoulders nearly touching, watching the stars come out hard and bright over the ridge. Below them in the valley, the frozen creek caught the moonlight and held it, and in Evelyn's pocket, a silver lighter with a dead man's initials waited. The territorial court in Copper Creek held session on the first and third Thursday of each month in a 2-room building next to the assayer's office that smelled permanently of mildew and pipe tobacco. Judge Abner Holt had retired the previous autumn, and his replacement, a man named Caulfield, who'd been appointed by the territorial governor, wouldn't arrive until spring. In the meantime, legal filings were processed through the court clerk and overseen by Sheriff Dale Pruitt. This was the first problem. Evelyn knew Pruitt's reputation, the same way everyone in Copper Creek knew it, not spoken aloud in polite company, but understood. He had a big house for a man on a sheriff's salary. His deputies ate well. He showed up reliably at Jubal Vance's table for Sunday supper, and had done so for the better part of 4 years. She told Gideon this on the ride in. "I know," he said. "Then you know filing with him is a risk." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "But if we don't file officially, we have nothing to stand on when the real judge arrives. A filed claim with a date stamp is harder to erase than one that never existed." She thought about that. He was right. She hated that the options were this narrow, but he was right. They rode into town mid-morning, Jessie staying back at the ranch on Gideon's firm instruction. The main street was busy with weekday commerce freight deliveries. Women marketing men gathered outside the feed store with the particular purposelessness of men with nowhere specific to be. Several people stopped and watched them pass. Several more made a point of not watching, which communicated the same information. The court building was dim inside, lit by 2 windows and a lamp on the clerk's desk. An older man named Purvis handled the actual paperwork, and Evelyn had dealt with him before. He was neither friendly nor hostile, just procedural, which was the best she could hope for. She laid out her documents: the original land grant in her father-in-law's name, the inheritance line, the death filing for Thaddeus, the record of her continued residence and improvement on the property. Purvis reviewed them without expression, making notes in his ledger. The front door opened behind them. Sheriff Pruitt came in with 2 of his deputies, which was 2 more than a routine filing visit required. He was a big man gone heavy, with a gray mustache and small eyes that moved around a room the way certain animals calculating distance and exit. "Mrs. Vance," he said it pleasantly. "Heard you were coming in today." The pleasantness was the tell. Genuine pleasantness doesn't announce itself that early in a conversation. Sheriff Evelyn kept her hands flat on the counter. Pruitt looked at Gideon for a long moment, conducting some private assessment. Gideon looked back at him with the same steady, unrevealing expression he brought to most situations. Purvis was still making notes, head down, pen scratching. Then the second door opened, the one that led from the clerk's office into the small courtroom. At the back, 3 men came through it. 2 of them were Jubal Vance's men, faces she recognized. The third man walked between them and in front of them. And when Evelyn's brain processed who she was looking at, her body went completely still, in the way bodies go still, before they either fight or collapse. Thaddeus Vance was alive. He looked older, thinner across the face, with new lines carved around his mouth and a beard he hadn't had before. He was wearing a decent suit, and he walked with the slightly elevated posture of a man who has rehearsed his entrance. His eyes found Evelyn immediately, and what moved through them wasn't love or guilt or any of the things a husband might feel seeing his wife after a long absence. The satisfaction of a card player finally putting down the hand he'd been holding. Evelyn. His voice was the same, that particular texture that had always managed to make her name sound like an accusation. The room had gone quiet in the absolute way. Rooms go quiet when everyone present understands that something irreversible is happening. Gideon moved fractionally. Not forward, not backward, just a slight shift in weight that meant he was ready. Evelyn felt it more than saw it. Jubal came through the door behind his nephew. He was smiling, which was worse than when he wasn't smiling. Pruitt cleared his throat. Well now, this is an interesting morning. What followed was conducted with the surface appearance of legal procedure, which made it considerably more nauseating than simple violence would have been. Jubal's lawyer, a man named Fitch, who'd ridden up from the Southern Territories and clearly been well paid for the trip, laid out the documents on the counter next to Evelyn's documents. Thaddeus Vance had not died. The death filing had been fraudulent, executed under a false name with a bribed county physician, orchestrated by Jubal to help Thaddeus disappear from a significant gambling debt owed to men who had very direct methods of collection. Thaddeus was alive and present, and legally Evelyn's husband, which meant the marriage had never ended, which meant every right she'd attempted to claim in the intervening month's property, residence, legal standing had been claimed by a woman who was, in the eyes of territorial law, a married woman acting without her husband's authority. Fitch explained this in the smooth, unhurried voice of a man who enjoyed his work. Purvis wrote in his ledger. Pruitt stood with his thumbs in his belt and watched Evelyn's face. She kept her face still. She was very practiced at keeping her face still. The property claim was void. Thaddeus, as her legal husband, held authority over the homestead and all associated water and mineral rights. Any actions taken to transfer or develop those rights in his absence were subject to review and reversal. Fitch shuffled his papers together. Furthermore, he paused for the pleasure of the pause. It has been brought to this office's attention that Mrs. Vance spent several nights in the company of Mr. Stone here, unchaperoned, during what we now understand was not a period of lawful widowhood. Gideon went very still. Mr. Stone is therefore subject to a charge of abduction and criminal violation of a married woman. Pruitt said it, almost apologetically, which fooled no one in the room. He nodded at his deputies. I'm going to need you to come with us, Stone. Everything happened fast after that. Gideon didn't resist the deputies. Evelyn understood why resistance meant more charges, meant less chance of a fair hearing when the real judge arrived, meant handing Jubal exactly the escalation he was hoping for. So Gideon stood with his jaw set and his eyes calm while the irons went on his wrists, looking at Evelyn the whole time with an expression she couldn't fully read. Thaddeus crossed the room to her. He reached out and took a handful of her hair and used it to pull her toward the door, and she heard herself make a sound she hadn't made since the early years of the marriage, a small involuntary sound of pain and old helpless fury. The street outside was wet with recent rain. The mud churned dark between the planks of the boardwalk. People had gathered. There were always people gathered when humiliation was being conducted publicly in a small town. Through the crowd, she could see the deputies moving Gideon toward the jailhouse. The irons on his wrists caught the gray light. His shoulders were straight. His chin was level. She heard him before she could see his face. His voice came over the noise of the crowd, and the rain and the blood in her ears, rough and carrying, and absolutely certain. I'm coming back for you. Nobody owns you. Thaddeus yanked her hair again, and she stumbled forward, and someone in the crowd laughed, and the rain came down harder, and the mud swallowed the sound of the irons and the wet boot steps and everything else, until there was nothing left but the cold and the gray and the iron grip of a man she'd believed she was finally permanently free of. She walked where she was pulled. But somewhere in her right hand, pressed hard into her palm with all four fingers, was a silver octagonal lighter with the initials T.V. Proof that this had all been planned, that none of it was law or justice or civilization. Just greed, wearing civilization's clothes. She held on to that lighter like it was the last solid thing in the world. Because right now it was. The cabin smelled exactly the same. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed when Thaddeus shoved her through the door. Jubal had rebuilt it, fast, rough timber, not squared. The walls already showing gaps where the cold came through, but the smell was the same. Lye soap and old grease, and the particular staleness of a space where a woman has worked herself to the bone for years, without a single window open by choice. She stood in the middle of the main room and breathed it in and felt 8 months of hard-won distance collapse like a poorly built fence. Thaddeus closed the door behind him. He didn't lock it. He didn't need to. He'd always understood that the most effective cage was the one a person builds inside their own mind, and he'd spent 3 years of marriage teaching Evelyn to build hers. He walked to the table and sat down and looked at her, the way a man looks at a piece of land he's been in dispute over. Already calculating use. Sit down, he said. She sat. The chair was new. Everything was new, cheap, and fast. The furniture of a man who'd grabbed what was available rather than what was good. Thaddeus studied her face for a moment. He was looking for the woman he'd left, the one who flinched at raised voices and apologized for taking up space, and had learned to make herself so quiet and small and accommodating that she barely registered as a person at all. He didn't quite find her. Something in his expression shifted, recalibrating. You look different, he said. People change, not property. He said it pleasantly, like a man observing the weather. The word went through her, and she let it go through her without grabbing it, without letting it do what it was designed to do. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her face level, and she waited, because waiting was information. She needed to understand what he knew and what he wanted before she gave him anything. He leaned back in the chair and laced his fingers over his stomach. Here's the thing, Evelyn. Jubal has a buyer, railroad syndicate out of St. Louis. They need water rights for the entire northern shipping route, and that aquifer under this property is worth more money than either of us will see in 3 lifetimes. Is that why you came back? Partly. He tilted his head. Jubal needed a living husband to make the sale legal. A widow's claim is complicated. A husband's sale is simple, so there it was. She was the mechanism, not the point. Her existence as his wife was a legal convenience, a signature on a document, a name on a deed. The aquifer was the point. She was just the most efficient path to it. And once the sale goes through? She asked. He smiled. Not a nice smile. It never had been. You'll be provided for? Modestly. She held his gaze and said nothing. He stood up, crossed the room toward her, slowly, with the deliberate patience of a man who'd learned that slow movement was more frightening than fast movement. He stopped in front of her chair and looked down at her and let the height difference do its work. I need your signature on the deed transfer, he said. Jubal will bring Fitch by in the morning. This can be simple, or it can be difficult. He paused. I remember which one you usually chose. She remembered which one she usually chose, too. She'd chosen simple because simple meant less pain. She'd chosen simple for 3 years, and at the end of 3 years she had raw hands and a burned cabin and a dead man's lighter in her pocket, proving the whole thing had been a lie from the beginning. "I'll need tonight to think," she said. He studied her, measuring whether that was resistance or procedure. He decided on procedure because that was what he expected from the woman he'd left. He was wrong about which woman was sitting in that chair. "Morning," he said, and he walked out to the back room and shut the door. Evelyn sat very still for 60 seconds. Then she got up and moved to the fireplace and crouched down to examine the hearth, running her hand along the inner edge of the stone until her fingers found what she was looking for. The old loose stone, third from the bottom on the right side. They'd rebuilt the walls fast and cheap, but the hearth was original stone. And she'd placed that stone herself in the first month of her marriage when she'd understood that she needed places in this house where she could keep things that were only hers. Behind the stone, nothing. She'd had nothing to hide for years, but the stone moved, and the space was there. She stood and looked around the room. The new shelving was sparse. A tin of salt, a half-empty flour sack, a few tools hung on iron pegs near the door. One of those pegs held a hammer. Beside the hammer, 3 bent nails, a length of rope, and a small collection of hardware detritus. From the construction, odd screws, a hinge pin, a handful of cut wire, and 1 rusty nail, about 4 inches long, sitting slightly apart from the others. She took it off the peg and felt the weight of it in her palm. Iron, heavy for its size. The point was still good. She put it in her dress pocket alongside the lighter. She sat back down in the chair and waited. She didn't make a plan so much as she let the situation clarify itself. There was 1 door in and 1 door out. There was 1 back window and 1 front window. Thaddeus was in the back room. The back window opened toward the tree line, which ran southeast in the direction of Gideon's Ranch Road. 3 miles through open terrain in freezing temperatures with no horse and no coat was survivable if she moved fast and didn't stop. She'd done worse. Around midnight, the door to the back room opened again. Thaddeus came in, carrying a lamp, and his face had the particular expression she remembered from the worst times in their marriage, the look that arrived after he'd been sitting alone with his thoughts long enough for those thoughts to turn hostile. He set the lamp on the table and looked at her. "Still up," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He moved toward her, and she stood before he reached her, putting the chair between them on instinct. He stopped, tilted his head, and then the pleasantness dropped off his face entirely, like a coat being shed. "I think you've forgotten how things work here," he said. "I think that big man and his good manners confused you about your situation." He came around the chair. "Let me remind you." He grabbed her arm above the elbow, and she went with the motion just long enough to get the angle she needed, and then she drove the rusty nail hard into the back of his hand. The sound he made was not language. He released her arm, staggered back against the table, knocking the lamp sideways. It didn't fall. Caught on the table's edge, staring at his hand, with an expression of pure, disbelieving shock. The nail had gone clean through the meaty part between the knuckles. Blood welled up dark around the iron. Evelyn was already at the door. She hit the night air running. The cold grabbed her immediately, brutal and immediate without a coat, but she was running, and her blood was up, and the tree line was right there, 100 yards across open ground, and she covered it before her body had time to register objection. She hit the pines and kept going. Behind her, she could hear him shouting. Then Jubal's voice from somewhere nearby, another building, a bunkhouse maybe raised in anger, demanding to know what had happened. Boots on frozen ground, a lantern swinging. She ran deeper into the trees, and the voices fell behind, and the dark closed around her. She ran, and somewhere in the dark, between the cold and the pine needles and the hard frozen ground under her feet, something came clear that had been building in her for months without quite arriving. Nobody was coming to save her tonight. Gideon was in irons. Jessie was a child. The law was Jubal's. The town was afraid or indifferent or both. She was it. She was the rescue. That wasn't despair. It wasn't panic. It was just true. And true things, once you stopped fighting them, have a way of becoming useful. She was free right now. She was moving. She had evidence in her pocket, and a direction in her head, and a body that had survived worse than a 3-mile run in the cold. She ran, and she was furious, and she was awake in every part of herself, in a way she hadn't been since before the marriage. Maybe since before her whole life got organized around other people's demands on her time and her body and her name. She was not property. She had never been property, and she was going to prove it. The tree line opened up onto the ridge road half a mile later, and she turned northeast and ran until she found a light. The light belonged to May Whitehorse. May ran the laundry operation on the north end of Copper Creek's working district, a large woman in her 50s, Shoshone, with iron gray hair and the calm, assessing eyes of someone who had been underestimated so many times she'd stopped bothering to correct it. She did laundry for most of the businesses in town, which meant she was trusted enough to enter every building and invisible enough that people forgot she was there. She'd been feeding information to Gideon's network of workers for the better part of 2 years. Evelyn didn't know this when she knocked on May's door at 2 in the morning, soaking wet and shaking with cold. She just knew May was the one person in Copper Creek she'd seen, refused to step aside when Jubal's men came through the market district. May opened the door, looked Evelyn over from boots to hair, and said, "Get in here," with the efficiency of someone who had handled emergencies before and found hysteria unhelpful. She had Evelyn in dry clothes and close to the kitchen stove within 5 minutes. She listened to the story without interrupting. When Evelyn produced the lighter, May looked at it for a long time. "I know about the lighter," she said. Evelyn looked at her. "I know about a lot of things." May set a cup of something hot in front of her. "Gideon has been helping our people out here for 3 years. Workers he's hired, housed, vouched for, when Pruitt's men came around looking for reasons. When Mr. Stone needs something done, we hear about it." She sat down across from Evelyn. "We already know about the jail. Jesse got word to us 2 hours ago." A small, satisfied expression crossed May's face. "That boy is smarter than most men I've met and considerably braver. He's been riding since sundown." Evelyn put her hands around the hot cup and breathed. The plan, as May laid it out, had the quality of something that had been thought through by people who understood the town's geography and personnel better than its official leadership did. Pruitt's jail was a 2-room building, with a deputy on the front door and another who made rounds every 2 hours. The rounds deputy had a route that took him past the saloon at precisely the point in his circuit when the saloon's back door was most conveniently positioned. May had people in that saloon. She had people at the livery who managed the horses and knew which ones Pruitt's deputies rode and how long they'd been out. She had people at the freight depot, including a man named Cato Large, quiet, formerly enslaved, now the most reliable freight handler in the territory, who had been waiting for an opportunity to settle a particular personal account with Deputy Briggs for the better part of 6 months. And she had Jesse, who had Gideon's spare rifle and knew how to load it, and had made it categorically clear to everyone involved that he would not be left behind. Evelyn looked around May's kitchen and realized that the room had quietly filled up while they talked. 7 people now: black workers, indigenous workers, 2 Mexican vaqueros who ran the Southern Cattle operation, and whose wages Jubal had shorted 3 seasons running. They sat and stood in the lamplight with the focused calm of people who had already decided they were doing this and were just working out the details. She was looking at the people Jubal's order had been built on the backs of. The people made invisible by design so that men like him could pretend they'd built something themselves. They were done being invisible tonight. Cato looked at Evelyn across the room. He had a face that had absorbed considerable punishment over the years, and rearranged itself into something permanent and unreadable. "You know that property," he said. It wasn't a question. Every inch of it. Water rights papers. Where would Jubal keep copies? "His saddlebag," she said. "He never lets documents out of arm's reach. Fitch will have the originals, but Jubal will have copies." Cato nodded, filed it away. The operation moved just before 4 in the morning, in the deep, cold hour when even dedicated men get slow and inward-looking. Evelyn stayed with May by the livery, out of sight but close enough to hear. The sounds that reached her were brief, and not particularly loud. A scuffle, one thump that she decided not to think about in detail, a door, the specific silence that follows when something complicated goes right. Then Gideon came through the livery door. His wrists were still red from the irons. His coat was gone, and someone had put a blanket around his shoulders instead, and he was moving, slightly stiff on the left side, where a deputy had apparently made a point during the arrest. He came through the door and stopped when he saw Evelyn, and for a moment he just looked at her, checking, cataloging, taking in the dry but wrong-fitting clothes, and the running-through-forest look of her hair, and the fact that she was upright and present and breathing. She looked back at him. His jaw moved. He swallowed whatever he'd been about to say and crossed the space between them and put his arms around her carefully, and she let him. "Jesse," she said into his shoulder. "Here?" Jesse's voice came from the stable door, slightly breathless, extremely awake, with the bright-eyed look of a boy who would be retelling this night for the rest of his life. Gideon released her, turned to take in the assembled group: May, Cato, the Vaqueros, the others. Something moved through his face that wasn't surprise. It was recognition, and beneath that, a gratitude too large for the available language. "I owe every one of you," he said. May waved her hand with the decisive impatience of a woman who had no patience for ceremonial debt. "You can owe us after. Right now we need to move before Briggs wakes up." Cato had brought horses, 4 of them, saddled and ready, pulled from the livery's back stock before the night deputy had realized what was happening. He handed Gideon a rifle lever action, already loaded, and a coat that was slightly too short in the sleeve but warm. Gideon checked the rifle with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom the motion is as natural as breathing. He looked at the group one more time. "The whole plan works only if Evelyn's claim gets heard by a real judge," he said. "We need to get to the territorial wire station at Miller's Crossing and send ahead for Judge Caulfield. We need him riding in before Jubal can get to the governor's office." "How long?" May asked. 2 days if the weather holds." May looked at the sky through the livery's open back door. The stars were out, hard and cold. "Weather'll hold tonight. Tomorrow's uncertain." "Tonight is what we have," Gideon said. He swung into the saddle. His silhouette, in the livery doorway, was enormous and dark against the night sky. The rifle across his knee, the blanket-turned coat pulled across his broad shoulders. Evelyn mounted the second horse. Jesse was already up on the third, his young face bright and serious and absolutely not going anywhere else, regardless of what anyone said. They rode out through the livery's back gate into the dark and the cold, away from Copper Creek and its bought law and its corrupt courtroom, and the snow that began to fall 10 minutes into the ride was light and clean and covered their tracks behind them, like the night was actively helping. Cato watched them go from the livery door. Then he went back inside, found Jubal's saddlebag in the back stall where Jubal's horse was boarded, and began going carefully through the contents by lantern light. The copies of the water rights documents were exactly where Evelyn said they'd be. Cato set them aside. He could read. Gideon had made sure of that, same as he'd made sure of Jesse. He read through the railroad syndicate agreement, twice, slowly, understanding what he was looking at. Then he folded the papers carefully into his coat, put out the lantern, and went to find May. There was a judge coming, and when he arrived, he was going to need to see these. The canyon locals, called Widow's Notch, had earned its name the hard way. 3 men had gone over its eastern rim in the 15 years since Copper Creek was settled, and not one of them had been recovered whole. The limestone walls dropped 60 feet straight down to a frozen creek bed, and in a blizzard, the wind came through the gap with a sound like a scream cut short. Gideon had known they'd end up here. Jubal was a man who needed terrain that worked in his favor, and Widow's Notch was the only choke point between Miller's Crossing and the main road south. They'd sent the wire to Judge Caulfield. They'd gotten confirmation back, and now Jubal had roughly 18 hours before a territorial judge rode in with federal authority and burned down everything he'd spent 4 years constructing. 18 hours made desperate men do predictable things. The snow had been building since midnight, coming in hard sheets off the northern ridge, and by the time Gideon spotted the first of Jubal's outriders positioned on the canyon lip, visibility had dropped to maybe 40 yards. He pulled his horse to a stop and held up a fist. Behind him, Evelyn and Jesse halted. "How many?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was steady. It had been steady for the last 2 hours, and he'd stopped being surprised by it. 2 on the north rim, at least 1 down in the notch itself. He studied the gap in the rock face. The lantern light moving through it told him the man down there wasn't hiding. He was waiting. "Jubal wants this clean. He'll want to talk first." "Jubal doesn't talk," she said. "He declares. There's a difference." She was right. He nudged the horse forward. They came through the notch entrance at a walk, unhurried, and found Jubal exactly where Gideon expected him, in the center of the canyon floor, mounted, flanked by 2 men with rifles already up. The lantern hung from a hook on his saddle horn and threw a circle of yellow light across the snow. And beside Jubal, also mounted, was Thaddeus. Thaddeus's right hand was bandaged thick with cloth that had bled through at the center. His face was tight with the specific fury of a man who has been humiliated by someone he considered beneath humiliation. He looked at Evelyn the way men like him always look at women who stop being afraid of them, with a kind of baffled outrage, like she'd violated a law of nature. Jubal raised one hand in a gesture that was almost cordial. "Gideon Stone," he said it like they were being introduced at a supper table. "I'll give you credit. You've caused me considerably more trouble than I expected." "I expect you'll survive it," Gideon said. "The judge can't help you." Jubal's voice tightened just slightly at the edges. "By the time Caulfield arrives, the deed transfer will be filed, witnessed, and sealed. You'll have a piece of paper and a handshake and nothing else. Or," Gideon said, "you'll have a room full of documented fraud and a federal charge for conspiracy to falsify a death record. And Caulfield will arrive to a trial instead of a filing." Jubal stared at him. "Cato found your copies," Evelyn said. Something moved across Jubal's face. Not fear men like Jubal didn't do fear in public. But beneath the surface, there was a rapid, cold recalculation happening, and everyone present could see it, even if they couldn't read the result. What no one was watching was Thaddeus. Gideon caught it from the corner of his eye, the slight shift in Thaddeus's position, the way his good hand had been moving in small, careful increments toward the revolver at his hip. He wasn't drawing on Gideon. He was drawing on Jubal. The shot came before Gideon could shout a warning. The noise of it cracked off the limestone walls and came back doubled, tripled, a rolling concussion that set the horses screaming and sent both outriders scrambling for cover on the rim above. Jubal lurched sideways in the saddle. His horse had bolted 2 steps, and he hauled it back. One hand pressed to his shoulder, blood already soaking dark through his wool vest. Not dead, but down. Thaddeus wheeled his horse toward Gideon with the revolver up, and his face had shed everything now, the pleasantness, the calculation, the rehearsed menace, and what was underneath was something rawer and uglier. Pure, stupid greed stripped of all its costumes. "The syndicate deal is mine," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You understand? Jubal was going to take the commission and leave me with a handout. 15 years I ran his errands. 15 years. He steadied the gun on Gideon. "Move away from her." Gideon didn't move. "I'll put you down where you sit." "You might," Gideon said. He kept his voice at the same level, flat and unhurried. like he was discussing weather. But you can't sign a deed transfer from a jail cell. And you can't sell water rights with a federal fraud charge in your name. And the judge is already 2 days out. Thaddeus blinked. The gun wavered a fraction. You don't have anything, Gideon said. Jubal's operation is finished. Fitch is gone by now if he's smart. The syndicate won't touch a deal with this much blood on it. Then I've got nothing to lose, Thaddeus said. And he cocked the hammer. Evelyn moved, not away from the gun, toward it. She'd picked up the rifle from Gideon's saddle scabbard sometime in the last 30 seconds, quietly and without announcement, and she brought it up and fired in one motion that was not elegant and not practiced but was absolutely certain. And Thaddeus's right leg buckled as the shot went through the meat of his thigh just above the knee. He screamed. The revolver discharged into the snow. His horse reared, and he came off it and hit the canyon floor hard, and the sound that followed was ugly and brief. And then there was silence, except for the wind and the muffled echo of the shot, still moving through the limestone. Thaddeus lay in the snow, clutching his leg, alive and furious and going nowhere. He tried to drag himself toward the fallen revolver. He got about 2 feet before his strength gave out, and he lay still, breathing hard, the snow coming down white and steady around him. He shifted, reached again for the gun. His fingers were 6 inches from the grip. Evelyn walked toward him. She walked the way she'd been walking for the past 3 days, like the ground belonged to her feet, and not the other way around. She picked up the revolver, checked the cylinder, with the brief, focused attention of someone who's watched a person do this enough times to know how. She put it in her coat pocket. Thaddeus looked up at her from the snow. You shot me, he said. He sounded genuinely shocked. You pointed a gun at Gideon, she said. She looked down at him for another moment. The man she'd been afraid of for 3 years of her life. The one whose voice she'd heard in her head every time she tried to take up space was lying in the snow of a mountain canyon, bleeding from his leg and holding his bandaged hand and staring up at her like she was someone he'd never seen before. Maybe he hadn't. She turned away and went back to where Gideon had dismounted and was holding his left side with one hand, his face arranged in an expression that said he was in more pain than he was planning to admit. You're hit, she said. Ricochet off the limestone. Before you fired, he let her pull his coat aside and look, a gouge along his lower left ribs, deep enough to bleed seriously, but not deep enough to mean what she'd been afraid it meant. She pressed her hand against it and felt him tighten under the pressure. I've had worse. I don't care what you've had before. Hold still. Behind her, Jessie had come through the notch entrance. She'd told him to stay back, and he'd complied with the technical letter of that instruction by staying just behind the entrance while everything happened, and was now moving between the fallen men with the focused alertness of someone cataloging the situation. Jubal's outriders had not come down from the rim. Jubal himself was still mounted, gray-faced and swaying, his horse standing quiet under him. Jessie looked at Gideon. Something moved through his young face relief first, then a kind of fierce, complicated pride. Gideon looked back at him. He raised his free hand 2 inches, just an acknowledgement, and Jessie straightened his spine and nodded, like they'd spoken a full sentence. The snow kept coming down. The canyon walls held it all in, and the wind that had been screaming through the gap earlier had dropped to something almost gentle. Lantern light caught the falling flakes and made them look like sparks in reverse. White sparks falling up instead of down. Evelyn finished pressing her scarf against Gideon's ribs and looked around at what the night had produced. Jubal Vance, shot by his own nephew, holding his shoulder together with one hand, the empire he'd built, starting to come apart at the seams in real time. Thaddeus Vance alive, which he would probably spend the rest of his natural life wishing he wasn't, given what was coming from the territorial court, and a judge, 2 days out with a wire in his pocket, and a collection of documented evidence that Cato had been sitting on all night. She thought about the lighter in her coat pocket, the small silver thing with TV engraved on the back that had started all of this unraveling. She thought about the loose stone in the hearth she'd kept clear for years in case she ever had something worth hiding. She thought about the wash tub and the lye soap and the blood she'd wiped away into the suds every morning, because looking at it made it worse. None of that was her life anymore. She reached out and took Gideon's hand. He wrapped his fingers around hers and held on, and they stood together in the snow while Jessie went to deal with the horses, and the long night of Widow's Notch finally, slowly, let them go. Judge Thaddeus Caulfield was not what anyone in Copper Creek had expected. He was small, for one thing slight and neat, with round spectacles and the dry, economical manner of a man who'd been reading case law for 30 years and had very little patience left for theater. He arrived 2 days after the wire, as promised, with 2 federal marshals and a court recorder, and he set up in the territorial courtroom without fanfare and started calling people in one at a time. He did not appear to be impressed by Jubal Vance's reputation. He appeared, in fact, to be actively uninterested in it. Gideon sat through 2 days of proceedings with his ribs wrapped tight and his expression neutral, watching Judge Caulfield work through the evidence with the methodical patience of a man clearing land one stump at a time. No drama, just the steady application of force in the right direction. Cato had handed over the syndicate documents. May had provided sworn testimony about Jubal's business practices from 3 years of doing laundry in every building in town. 2 of Jubal's former freight workers, who had traveled from the southern routes specifically for this, had given written depositions about wage theft and coerced signatures on contracts they hadn't been allowed to read first. And Purvis, the court clerk, the procedural, neither friendly nor hostile Purvis, who had been doing his job the same way for 11 years, had produced his original ledger with the land filing dates intact, which proved that Evelyn's claim predated the fraudulent death filing by 3 weeks. Thaddeus's lawyer, a local man named Garrett, who had not been compensated nearly enough for this situation, did what he could. It wasn't much. The death certificate fraud was indefensible. Once the bribed physician in the southern county had quietly agreed to cooperate with the federal marshal in exchange for reduced charges. And once the marriage's legal trap argument collapsed, so did everything built on top of it. Pruitt's testimony, when it came, was the thing Evelyn had dreaded most and found, in the end, almost anticlimactic. He sat in the courtroom with the collapsed look of a man who had made a long series of reasonable-seeming choices that had somehow produced an unreasonable result. And he answered Judge Caulfield's questions in a flat, reduced voice, and the answers were what everyone in the room had known for 4 years, without being able to prove. Caulfield listened, made notes, asked follow-up questions without apparent emotion. Then he called Evelyn in. The courtroom was half full. May was there, in the second row, sitting with Cato and 3 of the freight workers. Jesse sat on the end of the bench nearest the door, with his back very straight and his arms folded, radiating the controlled intensity of someone trying extremely hard not to vibrate with anticipation. Gideon was at the back of the room. When she came in, he caught her eye briefly. That was all. But it was enough. Caulfield reviewed the documents in front of him without hurry. Then he looked at Evelyn over his spectacles. Mrs. Vance, or perhaps I should say Miss Vance. He set the papers down, this land claim, the water rights. You understand what they represent, in monetary terms, given the railroad interest in this aquifer. I do, she said. And your intention, if this court recognizes your ownership. She had thought about this for 2 days. She'd thought about it in May's kitchen, and on the road, and in the long, quiet hours while Gideon slept, with his wrapped ribs moving slow, and even in the lamplight. She'd turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath, and every time she turned it, she came to the same answer. She stood up. The room went quiet. A natural gift shouldn't be used by the powerful to choke the weak, she said. True prosperity only means something when it's built on equality and compassion for our fellow human beings. She reached into her coat and produced a document she drafted with May's help the night before, in handwriting that was not pretty, but was clear and deliberate, and every word chosen. I'm requesting that the court recognize the aquifer as a public resource, not owned by me, not owned by a railroad, not owned by Jubal Vance or anyone after him, a commons, available to any homesteader or rancher who files a registered need small operations, prioritized large commercial interests limited by volume. Caulfield looked at the document. He read it twice. His expression, to the extent that it was possible to read it, suggested a man who had seen a great many surprising things in his career and was prepared to add this one to the list without excessive fuss. You understand this limits your own access as well. I understand. And you understand that you could legally retain full rights, sell to the syndicate, and retire comfortably for the rest of your natural life. I understand that too. Caulfield looked at her over the spectacles again. Then he looked at the room, at May, at Cato, at the freight workers in their worn coats, at Jessie back straight on the end of the bench. He looked back at Evelyn. The court finds in favor of the claimant, he said, and he said it the way he said everything without drama, just stating what was true. The fraudulent death filing is hereby voided. The marriage dissolution will proceed on grounds of fraud and abandonment. Land and water rights revert to Evelyn Vance as original claimant. He set the pen down. The Public Resource Charter will be incorporated into the territorial record. May let out a breath in the second row that was not quite a sound, but moved through the room like one. Jesse unfolded his arms. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, pressing his lips together, and then he looked at the floor. And Evelyn could see from across the room that he was doing the very determined work of not crying in public, which was something she recognized because she was doing it too. Gideon, at the back of the room, was entirely still. After the hearing cleared, after Caulfield and his marshals had taken Pruitt and what remained of Jubal's operation into custody, after the room had emptied, and the courtroom fell back into its usual smell of mildew and pipe tobacco, Evelyn sat alone at the table for a few minutes. She put her hands flat on the surface, looked at them. The cuts had healed to thin pink lines across her knuckles. The skin was still rough from years of lye soap, but the bleeding had stopped, the kind of stopped that felt like it might be permanent. May appeared in the doorway. "Come on," she told, making supper. "Don't argue with me about it." Evelyn looked up. "I wasn't going to argue." May gave her a look that said she'd heard that before. "Sure you weren't." She stood up. She walked out of the courtroom and into the late afternoon light, and Copper Creek laid itself out in front of her, dusty and imperfect and full of complicated people, doing complicated things. And for the first time in her memory, she looked at it and felt something like ownership, not of the land, of herself in it. Gideon was waiting on the steps. He handed her coffee without a word. She took it, and they stood side by side and watched the light go long and gold across the street. And the wind off the ridge was cold but not cruel, and the day was finally, at long last, done. Spring came to Copper Creek, the way it always does in high country, argumentatively, in fits and starts, one warm day followed by 3 cold ones, the snow retreating inch by inch up the slopes like it was leaving under protest. By May, the valley north of town was running green. The house sat on a low rise where the 2 ridgelines met, looking south toward morning. Gideon had started framing it in February, working through the tail end of winter, with the same unhurried consistency he brought to everything. And by the time the wildflowers started coming up along the creek, it had walls, a roof, a stone chimney with a hearth that drew clean, and a covered porch that caught the first sun of the day and held it until noon. Evelyn had put in the kitchen herself, not with his help with his company, which was different. He'd sit on an upturned crate with his coffee and watch her work, answering questions when she asked them and staying quiet when she didn't, and it was the most comfortable thing she'd ever experienced in a shared space, That particular kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from her. Jessie had opinions about the sleeping loft and lobbied hard for a window that faced east, which he got. The land claim was official now, filed and recorded in Caulfield's name, with a copy in the Territorial Archive. The public charter had been printed in the county paper, which had caused predictable outrage among the larger ranching operations and quiet relief among everyone else. 3 families had already filed registered need requests. Evelyn had processed them herself, sitting at May's kitchen table, with the ledger Caulfield had left in her care, and there was something in that work, the specific, practical, unglamorous work of making sure water went where people needed it, that satisfied her in a way she hadn't quite expected. She was thinking about that on the afternoon Gideon came and found her on the porch. He came around the corner of the house from the barn, pulling off his gloves, and stopped when he saw her, sitting there with the ledger closed in her lap, and her face turned up to the late afternoon light. He stood for a moment, just looking at her, the way he sometimes did, not hovering, not pressing, just acknowledging her presence in the world with the same directness he brought to everything else. He sat down on the porch steps. He was quiet for a while. The creek was running loud below them, snowmelt from the upper slopes rushing through the channel it carved every spring, filling the valley with that specific sound moving water in spring sunshine, which is one of the better sounds in the world and completely free. Jessie wants to send for more books, he said. He's written out a list. How long is the list? 2 pages. Good, she said. He turned the gloves over in his hands. He had the look of a man who'd been working up to something for a while and hadn't quite gotten there yet. She waited. She was good at waiting. She'd gotten even better at the kind of waiting that wasn't tense. That was just easy patience for a person to find their way to what they needed to say. He looked up at her. I've been thinking about what comes next, he said. Not the land or the water rights. The other part. He set the gloves down on the step beside him. I'm not a man who talks around things, so I'll just say it plain. Please, she said. I want to marry you. He held her gaze, steady as he always was. Not because you need protecting. Not because I pulled you out of a road one night and feel responsible. Because you're the most real person I've ever been in a room with, and I'd like to spend the rest of my life in the same rooms as you. He paused. On equal ground. Your decision's yours, mine. The big one's ours. That's the only way I know how to do it. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about who she'd been the first time she'd seen him on her knees in the dirt, wiping blood into her apron, keeping her eyes down. She thought about who she was now, not fixed, because people didn't fix the way. Broken things fix you. Carried the breaks with you, they became part of the structure, but upright, rooted, taking up her actual amount of space in the world, which turned out to be more than she'd been told, and exactly as much as she needed. She stood up. She took the 2 steps down to where he was sitting, and she took his face in her hands, the same way she had in the wagon in the blizzard, and she looked at him straight. Yes, she said. It was not a complicated word. It didn't need to be. It was just true, and true things, stated plainly, were enough. He exhaled. Something that had been held in his shoulders for a long time came loose. He brought his arms around her, and she let the warmth of him settle over her shoulders like something she'd chosen and could unchoose and was choosing again, right now, on purpose. They stood like that for a while, with the creek running and the light going gold along the valley and the smell of new grass coming up from the slope below the porch. Later, when the stars came out hard and clear over the ridge, the house was lit from inside with the warm copper light of the lamps. Jessie's loft window glowed, with the faint scratch of pen on paper audible. If you stood close, he was writing a letter to a school in Denver that had corresponded with Gideon about taking students in the fall, and he was writing it himself, in the careful, deliberate hand of someone who understood exactly what literacy cost and what it was worth. In the main room, the fire in the stone hearth threw its light across walls that smelled like fresh timber and wood smoke, and the particular aliveness of a house that people are actually living in. Evelyn let her hair down. It was a small thing, just pins out, hair loose around her shoulders. But it was hers, that small thing done in her own time, in her own space, for her own reasons. She stood in the middle of the room she'd helped build, and she felt every part of herself present and accounted for, in a way she hadn't known was possible. Gideon watched her from across the room with no urgency in him at all. She crossed to him. What happened that night was nothing like the desperate fire of the blizzard, and nothing like the careful, ice-melting first time. It was something new, easier, and deeper at once. The intimacy of two people who had crossed a considerable amount of difficult terrain together and arrived somewhere solid. She laughed once, which surprised her, and he looked so genuinely pleased by it that she laughed again. And it turned out that joy could be part of this too, that it wasn't too big or too strange or something that needed to be contained. She hadn't known that. She knew it now, and afterward, she lay in the new house on the hill, with spring air coming through the cracked window, and his arm warm across her, and the creek still running loud below. And she thought about the woman who had knelt by a washtub in a cracked yard with bleeding hands and a flat-iron sun pressing down on her, surviving minute to minute, and calling it a life. She sent that woman something across the distance of the past. Not pity. Something better. She sent her the knowledge that it would be okay, that she would get out, that she would build something real with her own hands on her own ground, and she would choose who stood beside her in it. And she would be no one's property, and no one's title, and no one's widow. Just Evelyn. Just herself. Outside, the spring night carried the sound of the creek, and the distant call of an owl in the pines, and the stars over the ridge burned steady and clear, and the house on the hill held its warmth against the dark the way a well-built thing does, without apology, without asking permission, simply there, and solid, and enough. There's a moment in this story that stays with you long after the last page. Evelyn Vance starts on her knees in the dirt, bleeding, with nothing left to her name. By the end, she's standing in a courtroom, declining a fortune-choosing, instead to sign that water source over to every struggling homesteader in the territory who needed it. That's not just a character arc, that's a life philosophy. What this story is really about isn't the land, or the villain, or even the romance, though all of that is there in full. It's about what happens when a person finally stops shrinking themselves to fit inside the space someone else decided they were allowed to occupy. Evelyn didn't find her strength because Gideon showed up. Gideon showing up just gave her enough breathing room to remember it was already there. That's an important distinction. The story never lets him be her rescue. It lets him be her witness. And there's a profound difference between those two things. Gideon himself carries a quiet lesson that hits harder the longer you think about it. Here is a man with every physical and social advantage the frontier offers: size, strength, reputation, freedom of movement, and he uses every single bit of it to hold doors open rather than walk through them alone. He teaches an orphaned black boy to read Douglas and ride straight and know his own worth. He stops the moment a woman asks him to stop. He builds a community of people the powerful had written off, and when that community saves him from a jail cell, he stands in that livery and says simply, "I owe every one of you." Not a speech, not a performance, just the honest acknowledgement that nobody gets anywhere alone, and that debt, when it's real, gets spoken out loud. May Whitehorse, Cato, the Vaqueros, the freight workers, they are not background. They are the infrastructure of every decent thing that happens in this story. Jubal's empire was built on their invisible labor, and it was dismantled by their organized courage. That's the West this story chooses to tell. Not the myth of the lone hero riding into the sunset, but the messy, human, collective truth that justice requires people to show up for each other across every line that power tried to draw between them. And then there's the water. Evelyn could have kept it. She had every legal right to. Instead, she stood before the court and declared it a commons, a shared resource, a public good, prioritized for the small and the struggling rather than the large and the hungry. In 1873 or today, that choice means the same thing. True prosperity isn't real if it's built on somebody else's thirst. Wealth that chokes the people beneath it isn't success. It's just a different kind of violence, wearing a nicer coat. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. The strongest thing a person can do, man or woman, then or now, isn't domination. It isn't the accumulation of land or money or power over other people. It's the willingness to stop, to see someone clearly, to say this body belongs to you, this water belongs to everyone, this ground is big enough for all of us, and then build your life around actually meaning it. Evelyn Vance bent for years, then she stopped bending. And everything that followed came from that one quiet, furious decision to stand back up and not apologize for taking up space. That's the story. That's all of it. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and dialogue are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or situations is coincidental.